Hello everybody and welcome back to our lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and for this lecture we are going to continue right along with our sort of end phase of United States history. And with this lecture we're going to begin our discussion on the Vietnam War. But before we begin discussing our lecture proper for today, I just like to do a customary recap and just touch bases on what we last discussed in the last lecture. So in our last lecture, we wrapped up the Kennedy administration. We touched bases again on Lyndon Johnson's administrations. We've been going over Lyndon Johnson's administration and also some parts of the Kennedy administration in our last two big lecture series. The last two lectures were on the Kennedy and the Kennedy/Johnson administrations. And before that, we discussed the civil rights movement, and a lot of the civil rights movement, a lot of the actions of the '60s occurred during the presidency of Lyndon Johnson. But in our last lecture, we looked at the election of in our last two lectures, we looked at the election of 1960. It was a pivotal moment. It was the first time that a minority candidate won election. It was a real watershed moment. Kennedy, of course, is Irish American, but he was a Roman Catholic, and that was a large obstacle for him to overcome. He did so, some say by the genuine merits of his arguments. Others attest his victory to the machinations of his father, Joseph Kennedy Sr. We examined a lot of the key moments of Kennedy's presidency, which was overwhelmingly dominated by the Cold War, and particularly dominated by events involving Cuba, most notably the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was without a doubt the closest that the United States and the Soviet Union ever came to war. And it all sparked by the Soviet response to the United States placing missiles in Greece and Turkey, and the Soviet Union wanted to place missiles in Cuba to sort of balance off the threat of an imminent attack. And of course, with examining Johnson, we must look at the Great Society and the legislative plan and the ideas that he had, the very progressive ideas that he had for improving the life of the average citizen in the Republic. Now, to get to our lecture proper for today, for this lecture, we're going to discuss what is perhaps aside from slavery and civil rights, what is deemed the most controversial subject in American history, the Vietnam War. And the name, the experience, the entire era sums up so many different emotions to so many people. To begin with, before we even get to American involvement in war, I just like to perform a recap of events regarding Vietnam during the mid-20th century. Vietnam was a French colony in what was then called the Indochine, or the French Indochine, or French Indochina. A couple of names for it, and it really corresponds to the area, the territory in Southeast Asia, sort of sandwiched in between the Indian subcontinent and China proper. The region where countries such as Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, that around that area. That's the old Indochine or Indochina. The Japanese Empire invaded in 1942. This was a part of those wealthy wealthy regions that the European powers had long held on to, that the Japanese wanted to seize. One of those regions that the Japanese sort of invaded and added to their growing formal empire, their overseas empire. But they were ousted in 1945 with the defeat of Japan and the return in force of Allied powers backed by the United States. Ho Chi Minh, who would eventually rise to the position of nationalist leader, issued a Declaration of Independence based on the United States Declaration of Independence shortly thereafter. But to his dismay, he found that the French had been returned to power in what is now Vietnam and really all of the Indochine, and that they were aided by the United States. Now, the United States did this as part of a quid pro quo deal for French involvement in NATO. It was much more pertinent to the United States foreign policy in the closing days of World War II and the beginning stages of the Cold War to have French involvement in NATO as a bulwark against the Soviet Union than to see the former colonies of the European nations achieve any sort of independence or national self-determination. Ho Chi Minh was undeterred by this, and he resisted the French and went on to resist and subvert the French colonial administration. And he achieved a great victory at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, which brought an end to French involvement in Vietnam. Now, beginning in 1954, the United States underwrote South Vietnam, the non-communist southern half of the country, and really prevented the elections from taking place, which would have led to reunification. And largely they did so because reunification would have occurred and it would have been carried by those in favor of reunification under Ho Chi Minh would have carried the day. And so it has an effort to forestall the communist unification of Vietnam. The United States simply agreed to support the South Vietnamese government's decision to not hold elections. Now, South Vietnam's inability to defend itself led to a steady increase in aid from the United States under both the Kennedy, Johnson, and the Eisenhower administrations. From Eisenhower through Johnson, the presidents rapidly built up forces. It would really explode under Kennedy and Johnson, hitting a high water mark under the Johnson administration. In 1968, there were over 500,000 American soldiers in Vietnam. Now, casualties and TV footage of troops persecuting Vietnamese villages or accidentally bombing children with napalm helped to turn public interest against the war, helped to turn public opinion against the war. Now, school campuses became centers of draft resistance. Church groups began to campaign against the war. Lyndon Johnson abandoned his 1968 re-election plans because of the opposition, the groundswell of opposition to the Vietnam War. And Richard Nixon campaigned in 1968 and spoke of a secret plan to end the war in Vietnam. After his elections, his proposal to achieve peace with honor would postpone an end to the fighting. Now, the Latin American forces withdrew from Vietnam in 1973, and the absence of American forces made the fall of South Vietnam all but inevitable. Now, American defense planners became involved in Vietnam because of the international policy plan known as containment, which called for the rigorous opposition to the spread of communism. This was a conscious act on their part to avoid appeasing the communists the way that the fascists had been appeased during the years in between World War I and World War II. It was deemed as weakness and is only enabling the foe that they would have to fight later on down the road. Now, the fear was that if you did not oppose communism, the new independent nations of the world will fall one by one like dominoes to it. Vietnam posed no ostensible threat to the United States, and at the same time, the federal government had less than 5 employees who could speak Vietnamese. And the general population was oblivious to the location of Vietnam. Sort of like a rundown on just how non-important Vietnam really was in the overall thinking of the Republic and the leaders of the Republic, and yet how central it will become because of the policy of containment. Now, the first American troops sent to Vietnam were sent as part of a force to aid the French in their effort to reestablish control over Vietnam after World War II. Many Americans participated in this phase of the war with a heavy conscience. Most held strong anti-colonial beliefs, and this largely stems because the United States had, after all, rebelled against a major global colonial power to achieve its own independence. The United States had wanted French cooperation in NATO desperately, and the French knew how to bargain very hard. They expected support in Vietnam had the price for their support for the United States in NATO. Now, the Battle of Dien Bien Phu was really the last gasp of any sort of French hope in Vietnam. It was the last gasp of the French army in Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh, the leader of the Viet Minh, the anti-colonial guerrilla forces, besieged and then overran the French fortress at Dien Bien Phu. The French had designed the fortress as a set piece that would be used to sort of leapfrog and catapult the French forces stationed in Vietnam, the Foreign Legion, to destroy the Viet Minh's power base. And after the defeat, the French were resigned to the reality that they could no longer regain control of their colony. Many of the peoples of Southeast Asia and Asia had bitterly hated the Japanese and the brutal legacy of their of the Japanese conquest. But they had also been enlightened by the success of the Japanese war machine that proved that an indigenous Asian force could meet and defeat a colonial power on the field on equal terms. Now, the lesson intensified anti-colonial feelings. The Geneva Accords officially brought the French colonial era to an end and temporarily divided Vietnam into two zones, one in the north and one in the south. And again, much like Korea, the northern zone was communist and the southern zone was democratic. And again, they were sort of, these northern and southern zones were split in influence. The northern zone would be communist, coming under heavy Chinese and Russian influence, and the southern zone would be influenced by the United States primarily. Now, the United States, after all of this, the United States immediately began to aid Diem, who was the leader of the South Vietnamese government. The United States had not really supported the Geneva Accords. It wasn't really in it really wasn't something that they got behind. They didn't sign it. Now, the Geneva Accords stipulated that after a period of pacification, once tempers had cooled, elections would be held to reunite the country. Now, Ho Chi Minh was the national hero of the Vietnamese for his efforts in driving out the French colonizer, and it was really forecasted that he would win the election. But this was really something that the United States could not get behind, because Ho Chi Minh was, after all, a communist leader, and it would do them no good to see the French withdraw from Vietnam, only to have a native leader, an indigenous Vietnamese leader, rise up and install communism over the country. Now, confronting these woes was the fact that Diem, the United States-backed leader of South Vietnam, had dictatorial tendencies and was very corrupt. Diem enriched himself and his family at South Vietnam's expense, and he also never developed the legitimacy that a ruler or a government needs to govern properly. He never developed any sort of support, widespread support amongst the people of South Vietnam. Now, most people in Vietnam were alienated by him and decided to join a new guerrilla group, the Viet Cong. And this group was based in South Vietnam, and they fought against the South Vietnamese government during the 1950s. And by the 1960s, the various opposition groups against the Diem's government in South Vietnam had coalesced into the National Liberation Front, the NLF. Now, this organization was dedicated to overthrowing the government of South Vietnam and reuniting the country under a communist government. So this is at the national level in Vietnam, different groups coming together and uniting under the communist banner. In the 1950s, most Americans were still idealistic about the situation in Vietnam. When the Geneva Accords went into effect, people living in either side of the new boundary were allowed to leave and resettle where they liked. If they wanted to be in the communist sphere, they could pick up and move. If they wanted to be in the democratic sphere, they could pick up and move. Vietnamese Catholics had wanted to move to the South, and the United States Navy oversaw this transition. President Kennedy and President Johnson, they both enlarged the American presence in Vietnam, and they did so in the face of the increasing unpopularity, the very deep unpopularity of Diem's regime, which was tainted in the eyes of his countrymen of the Vietnamese by French imperialism, because they were practicing Roman Catholics in a nation where most of the people were Buddhist. They had these very heavy-handed and harsh methods of governance. They were very, very heavy-handed in their governing style. One of the most hated measures was the introduction by Diem's sister-in-law, Madame Nhu, who herself was a very hated figure amongst the South Vietnamese. With the institution of Catholic principles had the basis of civil law in Vietnam, and again, this alienated many people who may have supported the South Vietnamese government, because even though on the surface, instituting Catholic principles as civic law may not seem altogether worrisome or troublesome or burdensome, in a country that was primarily Buddhist, that the clear majority of the people, the overwhelming majority of the people were Buddhist, it was offensive and it was alienating. Now, one of the groups that led the opposition to Diem's regimes were Buddhist monks themselves, who in a series of very dramatic protests set themselves on fire to show their contempt for the regime. The United States, for the United States, and also secondary leaders in Vietnam, it was very much understood that the unpopularity of Diem in Vietnam was a great great liability to the stability of the country and the ability of the country to sort of reach out and endear themselves to local populations. A plot soon began to circulate. An assassination plot soon began to circulate with Diem had the intended target. Now, United States forces on the ground got wind of the plot, and they sort of forestalled things on the ground and sent messages, the information back to Washington, D.C., so that leaders in the national government, the leaders of the Republic, could weigh in and decide what they wanted to do, how they wanted to move on this. Now, they forwarded this information to President Kennedy, who, after consulting with his own advisors, decided to let the plan move forward unimpeded. Now, ironically, a few weeks after Diem was assassinated, Kennedy was assassinated. And after Diem's assassination, the United States had hoped that its successor would be able to unite the rifts in the South Vietnamese government, will be able to bring the people of South Vietnam on board with the South Vietnamese government. But his successors in South Vietnam proved utterly incapable of doing so. After the assassination of Diem, the leadership of South Vietnam became a sort of revolving door, with military strongmen coming in and then exiting just as quickly, most likely through assassination. Most of them were assassinated, but it was just this revolving door of military strongmen coming in and not being able to really do anything to improve the situation in South Vietnam. The populace never got on, and the government was desperately dependent on the United States. Now, after Lyndon Johnson succeeded John Kennedy as president, he was resolute in his desire to show himself to be as hard on communism as Eisenhower and Kennedy had been. And with that being said, we'll break here and we'll come back with part 2 of this lecture. And as always, hit like, subscribe, and comment, and let me know what you thought about this lecture. And as always, I'm Ted, and I will see you guys next time for another lecture.